The morning sun cast long shadows across the cemetery grounds as Charles Walker stood among the gathering crowd. His weathered hands trembled slightly as he reached into his coat pocket, fingers finding the soft silk of the scarf he had carefully folded and placed there just hours before. The fabric still held traces of her perfume, jasmine and vanilla, the same scent that had filled their small apartment for 37 years. Charles had met Margaret on a rainy Tuesday afternoon in 1986. He was working as a mechanic at Sullivan's Auto Shop on the corner of 5th and Main, covered in grease and exhausted from a particularly difficult transmission repair. She had rushed in, soaking wet, holding a broken umbrella and asking if anyone could help with her car that had died 2 blocks away. Her hair was plastered to her face, mascara running down her cheeks, but when she smiled at him, Charles felt something shift in his chest. "I'm sorry to bother you," she had said, wringing water from her coat. "I know you're probably closing soon, but I don't know what else to do." Charles had grabbed his toolbox without hesitation. He spent the next hour in the rain, fixing her alternator while she held an old newspaper over his head, trying to keep him dry. They were both thoroughly soaked by the time he got her car running again. When she tried to pay him, he refused, saying her smile was payment enough. She laughed, a sound like wind chimes that he would chase for the rest of his life, and insisted on buying him dinner instead. Their first meal together was at Murphy's Diner, a little place that served the best apple pie in town. They sat in a corner booth, their clothes still damp, talking until the owner politely told them he needed to close. Charles learned that Margaret was a kindergarten teacher who collected vintage scarves and loved old jazz records. She discovered that he rebuilt motorcycles in his spare time and had a secret passion for poetry, though he was too shy to share any of his writings. 6 months later, Charles proposed with a ring he had saved for by working extra shifts and eating peanut butter sandwiches for lunch every day. He took her to the spot where her car had broken down, now their special place, and got down on one knee right there on the sidewalk. She said yes before he could even finish asking the question, tears streaming down her face as she pulled him up for a kiss that stopped traffic. Their wedding was small but perfect. Margaret wore her grandmother's dress and a silk scarf that had belonged to her mother, pale blue with tiny flowers embroidered along the edges. She would later tell Charles that the scarf made her feel like her mother was there with them, blessing their union. From that day forward, she wore a scarf almost every day, building a collection that would eventually fill 2 closets and countless boxes. The early years of their marriage were marked by simple joys and manageable struggles. They rented a tiny apartment above a bakery, waking each morning to the smell of fresh bread. Charles continued working at the auto shop while Margaret taught her kindergartners, coming home each day with stories about their antics and pockets full of crayon drawings. They saved every penny they could, dreaming of buying a house with a garden where Margaret could grow roses and Charles could have a proper garage for his motorcycle projects. Their first major challenge came 3 years into their marriage when they discovered they couldn't have children. The news devastated them both, but Margaret especially took it hard. She would cry quietly at night when she thought Charles was asleep, her shoulders shaking beneath the quilt her mother had made them as a wedding gift. Charles would pull her close, whispering that she was enough for him, that their love was complete just as it was. Slowly, Margaret found other ways to channel her maternal instincts. She became the teacher every child remembered, the one who stayed late to help struggling students and showed up at every school play and soccer game. Their apartment became a haven for neighborhood kids who needed a safe place to do homework or just someone to listen. Charles would come home to find their living room full of children, Margaret in the center like a mother hen, helping with math problems while cookies baked in the oven. The scarf collection grew alongside their love. Each piece told a story, the red silk one from their 5th anniversary trip to San Francisco, the hand-painted one from a student's family who had moved from India, the cashmere one Charles had saved for 6 months to buy her for Christmas. Margaret wore them with everything, draped elegantly around her shoulders or tied jauntily around her neck. The scarves became her signature, as much a part of her as her gentle laugh and the way she always smelled faintly of vanilla. In 1998, they finally saved enough for a down payment on a small house with a wraparound porch and a backyard big enough for the garden Margaret had always dreamed of. The day they moved in, Charles carried her over the threshold while she laughed and protested that they were too old for such nonsense. They spent that first night sitting on the porch steps, sharing a bottle of cheap champagne and planning where they would plant the rose bushes. Life settled into a comfortable rhythm. Charles opened his own repair shop, building a reputation for honest work and fair prices. Margaret continued teaching, touching hundreds of young lives over the years. Their house became the heart of the neighborhood, known for summer barbecues and Margaret's legendary chocolate chip cookies. She would sit on the porch in the evenings, always with a scarf around her shoulders, waving at neighbors and chatting with anyone who stopped by. The years brought their share of sorrows, the loss of parents, friends who moved away or passed on, economic struggles that forced them to tighten their belts. But, through it all, Charles and Margaret faced everything together. He would find her in the garden when she was sad, kneeling among her roses with dirt under her fingernails and tears on her cheeks. She would bring him coffee in the garage when work stressed him out, sitting on an overturned bucket while he tinkered with an engine and talked through his worries. Their silver anniversary was celebrated with a party that spilled out of their house and into the street. Former students, now adults with children of their own, came to honor the teacher who had believed in them. Neighbors brought covered dishes and stories of kindness as large and small. Charles surprised Margaret with a vintage scarf from the 1920s that he had found at an estate sale and had professionally restored. She wore it that night as they danced to their wedding song in the backyard, paper lanterns casting soft light over the faces of everyone they loved. As they entered their 60s, they talked about retirement and all the travels they would finally take. Margaret had always wanted to see Paris, to buy a scarf from a little boutique on the left bank. Charles promised they would go for their 40th anniversary, already secretly researching flights and hotels. They would walk along the Seine, eat too many croissants, and visit every museum she wanted to see. But life, as it often does, had other plans. The first sign something was wrong came on an ordinary Thursday morning. Margaret couldn't remember where she had put her favorite scarf, the blue one from their wedding day. They found it eventually, in the refrigerator of all places, and laughed about getting old. But the forgetfulness continued, missed appointments, repeated stories, confusion about familiar routes. Charles noticed but said nothing at first, hoping it was just stress from a particularly difficult school year. The diagnosis came after Margaret got lost driving home from school, a route she had taken for over 20 years. The doctor's words, early onset Alzheimer's, hung in the air like a death sentence. Margaret gripped Charles's hand so tightly her knuckles turned white, but she didn't cry. Not then. The tears came later, at home, as Charles held her on their bed and promised he would be there every step of the way. The progression was cruel in its relentlessness. First, it was small things, forgetting names, misplacing items, confusion about dates. Margaret retired from teaching earlier than planned, spending her days in the garden or organizing and reorganizing her scarf collection. Charles cut back his hours at the shop, then eventually sold it to spend more time with her. They took that trip to Paris while she could still enjoy it, buying not one but 3 scarves from the little boutique she had dreamed about. Good days became precious gifts to be treasured. On those days, Margaret was almost herself, laughing at Charles's jokes and humming while she cooked. She would tell him stories about her students, some from 30 years ago as if they had happened yesterday, and he would listen as if hearing them for the first time. Bad days were harder, when she didn't recognize the house or became frightened of the man sharing her bed. Charles learned to be patient, to redirect her gently, to find ways to reach the woman he loved through the fog of her disease. The scarves became a comfort to her as her world narrowed. She would run her fingers over the different fabrics, sometimes remembering their stories, sometimes just enjoying the textures. Charles would drape them over her shoulders when she was agitated, and often it would calm her. He learned which ones she preferred, the soft cashmere for difficult days, the bright silk when she seemed more aware. Their 40th anniversary came and went quietly. Margaret no longer remembered the significance of the date, but Charles made her favorite meal and played their wedding song. She smiled when he tied the blue scarf around her shoulders, though he wasn't sure if she remembered why it was special. They slow danced in the living room, her head on his shoulder, and, for a moment it was as if the years had fallen away. The final decline came swiftly. A fall in the garden led to a broken hip, and Margaret never quite recovered. She stopped recognizing Charles for days at a time, calling for her mother or asking to go home while sitting in the house they had shared for over 20 years. He hired help during the day but insisted on caring for her himself at night, sleeping in a chair by her bed so he would hear if she needed anything. The hospice nurse had arrived on a Wednesday morning in late October. Charles watched from the doorway as she examined Margaret, her gentle hands checking vital signs while Margaret stared at the ceiling, lost in a world only she could see. The roses outside the bedroom window were in their final bloom, and their sweet scent drifted through the open window, mixing with the lavender sachets Margaret had always kept in her drawers. "She's comfortable," the nurse, whose name was Elena, told Charles quietly in the hallway. "But her body is tired. You need to prepare yourself." Charles nodded, though the words felt impossible to process. How did one prepare to lose half of their soul? He returned to Margaret's bedside, taking her thin hand in his. Her wedding ring, now too large for her finger, caught the afternoon light. He had placed tape behind it to keep it from sliding off, a small act of preservation in the face of so much loss. That evening, something remarkable happened. Margaret's eyes cleared, focusing on Charles's face with recognition for the first time in weeks. "Charlie," she whispered, using the nickname only she had ever called him. "Have you been here long?" "Not long," he lied, his voice thick with emotion. "How are you feeling, sweetheart?" "Tired," she admitted, then smiled, that same smile that had undone him in the auto shop 40 years ago. "But happy you're here. Will you tell me a story?" So Charles told her about the day they met, embellishing the details to make her laugh. He described the rain as a torrential downpour of biblical proportions, himself as a knight in greasy armor, and her as the beautiful damsel who had tamed his wild heart. Margaret listened with her eyes closed, occasionally squeezing his hand to show she was still with him. "I want to wear the blue scarf," she said suddenly, opening her eyes. "The one from our wedding. Is it here?" Charles's heart clenched. The blue scarf was in the closet, carefully preserved in tissue paper. He retrieved it quickly, the silk cool against his palms. As he draped it around her shoulders, Margaret sighed contentedly. "Now I'm ready," she said, though for what, she didn't specify. They spent that last lucid evening together talking about everything and nothing. Margaret asked about her roses, and Charles assured her they were beautiful, not mentioning that he had been too distracted to properly tend them. She worried about her students, and he told her they were all doing well, creating happy endings for children she had taught decades ago. When she grew tired, he sang to her old jazz standards she had loved, his voice rough but sincere. "Promise me something," Margaret said as the moon rose outside their window. "When I go, don't stop living. Don't sit in this house becoming a ghost. Find joy again, Charlie. Promise me." Charles couldn't speak past the lump in his throat, so he just nodded and kissed her forehead. She smiled, satisfied, and drifted off to sleep. It was the last real conversation they would have. The following days blurred together in a haze of medication schedules, whispered conversations with Elena, and long hours spent simply watching Margaret breathe. Friends and neighbors stopped by to say goodbye, though Margaret rarely woke for visitors. Her former students sent cards and flowers, filling the room with color and love. Charles read every message aloud, hoping somewhere deep inside she could hear how much she was loved. Father Michael from St. Catherine's came to perform last rites. Charles wasn't particularly religious, but Margaret had maintained her faith throughout her illness, often asking to go to church even when she couldn't remember why. The priest was kind, speaking softly to Margaret and offering Charles comfort he didn't know how to accept. After he left, Charles found himself praying for the first time in years, not for a miracle, just for mercy, for Margaret's suffering to end peacefully. On her last morning, the house felt different. The October air was crisp and clear, and sunshine flooded the bedroom. Charles had spent the night in his chair, dozing fitfully, Margaret's hand in his. He woke to find her awake, her breathing shallow but her eyes fixed on something beyond his sight. "Do you see them?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "They're all here. Mama, Daddy, and look at all the children, Charlie. So many children." Charles squeezed her hand, tears flowing freely now. "That's wonderful, sweetheart. They're waiting for you." Margaret turned her gaze to him then, and, for a moment, she was entirely present, entirely his Margaret. "I loved you from the first moment I saw you," she said clearly. greasy coveralls and all. Thank you for my beautiful life. Thank you for sharing it with me, Charles managed to say. She smiled once more, that radiant smile that had lit up his world for 4 decades, and then, her eyes fluttered closed. Her breathing slowed, each exhale longer than the last. Charles held her hand and talked to her about their first date, their wedding, the house they had made a home, the garden she had tended, the lives she had touched. He talked until his voice was hoarse, until the spaces between her breaths grew infinite, until Elena gently placed a hand on his shoulder and confirmed what he already knew. Margaret was gone. The hours that followed passed in a strange fog. Elena made the necessary calls while Charles sat frozen at Margaret's bedside, still holding her cooling hand. The funeral director arrived with practiced sympathy, speaking in hushed tones about arrangements and choices. Charles heard himself answering questions, making decisions, but felt disconnected from it all, as if watching someone else navigate this impossible task. It wasn't until they prepared to take Margaret's body that Charles fully grasped the finality of the moment. As they lifted her onto the gurney, the blue scarf slipped from her shoulders. Charles caught it reflexively, the silk soft against his palms. It smelled of her, jasmine and vanilla, the scent that had meant home for so long. Without thinking, he pressed it to his face, breathing deeply, trying to capture something ineffable before it faded. "Sir," the funeral director prompted gently. "Would you like us to?" "No," Charles said firmly, folding the scarf carefully. "I'll keep this." The house felt cavernous after they left. Charles wandered from room to room, seeing Margaret everywhere, in the kitchen where her apron still hung on its hook, in the living room where her knitting lay abandoned in her favorite chair, in the garden where her roses bloomed without her care. He finally ended up in their bedroom, sitting on her side of the bed, the blue scarf clutched in his hands. The next days were a whirlwind of planning and preparation. Margaret's niece, Sarah, flew in from Seattle to help with arrangements. Together, they chose flowers, roses, of course, selected readings, and picked photographs for the memorial display. Charles insisted on including pictures from every phase of their life together, young and hopeful, middle-aged and content, older and still radiantly in love. The hardest task was choosing what Margaret would wear. Sarah suggested the dress Margaret had worn to their 35th anniversary party, a deep purple that had complemented her silver hair. But something was missing. "She needs a scarf," Charles said, standing before her open closet. Hundreds of scarves hung there, each a memory, each a piece of their story. His hands passed over the bright prints, the delicate laces, the bold geometrics, before stopping at a cream silk scarf with golden threads. Margaret had worn it to every important school event, calling it her lucky scarf. This one, he decided. She would want to look nice for all her students. The wake was held at McMurray's funeral home, the same place where they had said goodbye to Margaret's parents years before. Charles stood at the entrance, shaking hands and accepting condolences, the blue scarf folded carefully in his jacket pocket. He found himself touching it periodically, a talisman against the unreality of the situation. The turnout was staggering. Teachers Margaret had worked with, some now retired themselves, came to pay their respects. Parents spoke of how Margaret had changed their children's lives. Former students, now adults with graying hair and children of their own, waited in long lines to share their memories. Charles heard story after story of Margaret's kindness, her patience, her ability to see potential in every child. "She taught me to read," one woman said, tears streaming down her face. "I was so far behind, but Mrs. Walker never gave up on me. She stayed after school every day for months. I became a teacher because of her. She bought my son shoes," an elderly man shared. "We were too proud to ask for help, but somehow she knew. She said they were extras from a sale, but I knew better." That was just her way. As the evening wore on, Charles found himself oddly comforted by these stories. Each one revealed another facet of the woman he had loved, showing him that her kindness had rippled out in ways he had never fully grasped. Margaret had been more than his wife, she had been a force of good in the world. The funeral was scheduled for Saturday morning. Charles woke before dawn, unable to bear the emptiness of their bed any longer. He made coffee too strong, the way Margaret had always teased him about, and sat on the porch watching the sun rise over her garden. The roses needed deadheading, and weeds had begun to creep into the flower beds. Margaret would have been horrified. He dressed carefully in his best suit, the one Margaret had insisted he buy for their anniversary party 5 years ago. "You look handsome," she had said when he tried it on, adjusting his tie with practiced hands. "Like the day we married, only with more character." He tried to tie the tie now as she had then, but his fingers fumbled with the knot. After 3 attempts, he gave up and went without. Sarah drove them to the church, understanding intuitively that Charles couldn't manage it himself. St. Catherine's was already filling when they arrived, the October morning crisp and bright. Father Michael met them at the door, his face kind but somber. "She would be amazed by this turnout," he said softly, gesturing to the growing crowd. "No," Charles corrected gently. "She would be embarrassed by the fuss but secretly pleased." They had reserved the front pew for family, but Charles found himself glancing back repeatedly as the church filled. He recognized many faces, neighbors, shop owners, the mailman who had always chatted with Margaret about her flowers. But there were also strangers, people whose lives had been touched by Margaret in ways Charles was only now discovering. The service began with Margaret's favorite hymn, Amazing Grace. Charles tried to sing along but found his voice catching on every word. Sarah took his hand, squeezing gently, and he was grateful for the anchor. Father Michael spoke beautifully about Margaret's life of service, her dedication to children, her faithful partnership with Charles. But the words seemed to float past Charles, unable to penetrate the fog of his grief. The eulogies began with Margaret's fellow teachers. Janet Morrison, who had taught in the classroom next door for 20 years, spoke about Margaret's infinite patience and her gift for seeing potential where others saw problems. She told the story of a particularly challenging student who had thrown chairs and screamed obscenities, how Margaret had simply sat on the floor with him day after day until he felt safe enough to trust her. That boy had grown up to become a pediatric nurse, and he was here today, Janet pointed out, sitting in the 5th row with tears on his face. Former students came forward one by one. A young woman named Amy, now a mother of 3, recalled how Mrs. Walker had noticed she was coming to school hungry and had started keeping an extra lunch in her desk just in case someone forgot theirs. A successful businessman named Robert talked about his severe dyslexia and how Margaret had taught him to see it not as a disability but as a different way of thinking. He credited his innovation in technology to her early encouragement. Charles listened to each story with wonder and pain intertwined. How many lives had Margaret touched that he never knew about? How many children had she fed, clothed, encouraged, and loved into becoming their best selves? The magnitude of her quiet service overwhelmed him. When it came time for Charles to speak, Sarah helped him to the podium. He had prepared remarks, carefully written on index cards, but, as he looked out at the sea of faces all here for his Margaret, the words seemed inadequate. He set the cards aside and spoke from his heart. Margaret would be embarrassed by all this fuss, he began, his voice stronger than he expected. She never saw herself as doing anything special. To her, loving children, helping neighbors, tending roses, this was just life as it should be lived. He talked about their 40 years together, about the woman who had transformed a grease-covered mechanic into a better man simply by believing he was capable of it. He shared the story of their meeting, drawing gentle laughter when he described her holding a newspaper over his head in the rain. He spoke of her scarf collection, how each piece told a story of generosity, adventure, or love. She wore scarves every day, Charles said, his hand moving unconsciously to his pocket. Said they made her feel dressed even in a simple outfit. But I think they were more than that. They were her way of wrapping herself in memories, in the love of students who had moved away, in the places we'd traveled, in the life we'd built together. His voice broke then, and he paused, gripping the podium. The church was silent except for quiet sniffles and the rustling of tissues. Charles reached into his pocket and pulled out the blue scarf, holding it up for everyone to see. This was her wedding scarf, he continued. It belonged to her mother, and she wore it the day we married. She wore it again last week, on our last evening together. It still smells like her, jasmine and vanilla. I'm going to miss that smell. I'm going to miss everything about her. He folded the scarf carefully and returned it to his pocket. But Margaret made me promise not to stop living. She knew I'd want to curl up in our house and become a hermit, surrounding myself with her things and my memories. She was usually right about everything, and she was right about that too. So I'm going to try to honor her wishes. I'm going to tend her roses. I'm going to visit her students. I'm going to volunteer at the school. And I'm going to remember that every day is a gift, just as she did. Charles returned to his seat amid tearful applause, something typically unheard of at a funeral, but somehow perfect for Margaret. Sarah squeezed his hand again, and he saw she was crying too. Father Michael concluded the service with a final prayer and blessing. As the pallbearers, all former students Margaret had particularly loved, prepared to carry the casket, the organist began to play "What a Wonderful World," Margaret's favorite song. Charles had specifically requested it, knowing she would prefer something hopeful to traditional funeral dirges. The procession to Riverside Cemetery was long, cars stretching back as far as Charles could see. October leaves fell like confetti, carpeting the ground in gold and scarlet. Margaret would have loved the colors, would have collected the prettiest leaves to press in books or use in her kindergarten crafts. At the graveside, chairs had been arranged under a green canopy. Charles sat in the front row, Sarah on one side and Margaret's elderly sister Ruth on the other. The crowd gathered in a large semicircle, many standing because there weren't enough chairs. Father Michael spoke final words of commitment, his voice carrying across the hushed cemetery. As they prepared to lower the casket, something unexpected happened. Amy, the woman who had spoken about Margaret keeping extra lunches, stepped forward. From her purse, she pulled out a small silk scarf purple with butterflies and laid it gently on the casket. "She gave this to me when I graduated high school," Amy explained softly. Said butterflies reminded her that we all transform into who we're meant to be. It was as if a dam had broken. One by one, mourners came forward. Some placed scarves on the casket, gifts from Margaret that they had treasured. Others left drawings, clearly the work of young children, some yellowed with age. Teachers left apples. Former students left photographs of their own children, whom Margaret had never met but would have loved. The casket disappeared under a sea of tributes, each one a testament to a life well lived. Charles watched through blurred vision as the cemetery workers looked questioningly at Father Michael, unsure how to proceed with all the items. The priest nodded to leave them, understanding that this was how Margaret should be laid to rest, surrounded by evidence of the love she had sown throughout her life. When the casket was finally lowered, Charles stood on shaking legs. Tradition called for him to throw the first handful of earth, but, instead, he reached into his pocket. He pulled out the blue scarf one more time, pressing it to his lips before letting it flutter down onto the flower-covered casket. The silk settled gently, a piece of his heart going into the ground with the woman who had carried it for 40 years. "Goodbye, sweetheart," he whispered. "Save a dance for me." The reception was held at the church hall, where the ladies' auxiliary had prepared enough food to feed twice the number of people who had come. Charles found himself at a table surrounded by Margaret's teacher friends, their stories flowing as freely as the coffee. They laughed more than they cried, sharing Margaret's funnier moments, the time she had accidentally dyed her hair green before parent-teacher conferences, how she had once chased an escaped hamster through the school wearing an evening gown because it had gotten out during the spring concert. "She lived more in one day than most people do in a year," Janet said, patting Charles's hand. "And she loved you more than anything in this world. She told us so every single day." As the afternoon wore on, Charles felt the exhaustion of the past weeks settling into his bones. Sarah noticed and quietly suggested they head home. But, as they prepared to leave, a young woman Charles didn't recognize approached hesitantly. "Mr. Walker? I'm sorry to bother you. I'm Jennifer Chen. Mrs. Walker was my teacher in 1995. Charles shook her hand, trying to place her face among the hundreds of students Margaret had taught. "I wanted to thank you," Jennifer continued. "And to give you this." She pulled out an envelope, worn soft with age. "Mrs. Walker wrote this to me when I graduated from high school. I've carried it with me everywhere, through college, medical school, my residency. I've read it whenever I felt like giving up. I thought you should see what your wife meant to us." Charles took the letter with trembling hands. Margaret's handwriting, still clear after all these years, swam before his eyes. Dear Jennifer, I am so proud of the young woman you've become. When you first came to my class, so shy you wouldn't speak above a whisper, I knew there was something special inside waiting to bloom. Remember that becoming a doctor isn't just about the science, it's about seeing each patient the way I tried to see each of you, as a whole person worthy of patience, kindness, and respect. You have those qualities in abundance. The world needs healers like you. With love and faith in your journey, Mrs. Walker. She was right, Jennifer said, tears on her cheeks. I became a pediatric oncologist. Every time I have to tell parents difficult news, I think of how she would do it, with honesty but also with hope. I just wanted you to know that her influence didn't stop at the classroom door. It goes on and on, in ways she probably never imagined. Charles couldn't speak. He pulled Jennifer into a hug, this stranger who carried his wife's wisdom into operating rooms and hospital wards. When she left, he sat back down heavily, the letter still in his hands. She really was amazing, Sarah said softly. Yes, Charles agreed. She really was. The drive home was quiet. Charles stared out the window at the familiar streets, everything the same yet irrevocably changed. Margaret would never again point out Mrs. Henderson's new rose bushes or wave at the Thompson children playing in their yard. Her absence was a presence unto itself, filling all the spaces she used to occupy. Sarah stayed for another week, helping Charles sort through the immediate necessities. They went through Margaret's closet together, Sarah tearfully selecting a few scarves to remember her aunt by. They organized the medical bills, the insurance paperwork, the 1,000 details that death leaves in its wake. But, mostly, Sarah just kept Charles company, understanding that the hardest part would come after everyone left, when he had to face the silence alone. On her last night, they sat on the porch watching the sunset. Uncle Charles, Sarah said carefully, I've been thinking. Maybe you should come stay with us in Seattle for a while. Just until you figure out what comes next. Charles appreciated the offer but shook his head. This is my home, he said simply. Our home. I need to be here, at least for now. I need to figure out who I am without her, and I can't do that by running away. Sarah didn't argue, the worry creased her forehead. They said goodbye the next morning, promising to stay in touch, to visit soon. Charles waved from the porch until her rental car disappeared around the corner, then went back inside to face his new reality. The first few weeks were the hardest. Charles would wake expecting to find Margaret beside him, would make 2 cups of coffee before remembering. He started conversations with her a dozen times a day, would hear a bit of gossip or see something funny on television and turn to share it with empty air. The house echoed with her absence, no humming in the kitchen, no gentle scolding about his muddy boots, no soft footsteps padding down the hallway. He tried to maintain their routines. He tended her roses, though his efforts were clumsy compared to her practiced hands. He attended Sunday services, sitting in their usual pew, the space beside him achingly empty. He even went to the school to volunteer as Margaret had asked, but seeing her former classroom with another teacher's decorations was too painful. He fled after an hour, ashamed of his weakness. The scarves were everywhere. In closets, in drawers, draped over chairs where she had left them. Each one smelled faintly of her perfume, and Charles found himself carrying them from room to room, draping them over his shoulders as he watched television or worked in the garage. It was a poor substitute for her presence, but it was something. Winter arrived early that year, blanketing the town in snow by Thanksgiving. Charles spent the holiday with Sarah's family in Seattle, trying to seem grateful for their company while feeling like a ghost at the feast. He returned home to find Margaret's roses brown and bent under the weight of snow, and something about their deadness broke the dam of his grief. He sat in the snow-covered garden and wept, great heaving sobs that left him exhausted and empty. December was a blur of forced normality. Charles put up a small Christmas tree because Margaret would have wanted him to. He sent cards to their friends, though signing just his name felt like another admission of loss. Well-meaning neighbors invited him for holiday dinners, and he accepted a few to be polite, but mostly he preferred the honest loneliness of his empty house to the suffocating sympathy of others. On Christmas Eve, he found himself at her grave. Someone, he suspected Janet Morrison, had left a small wreath with a red bow. Charles brushed snow from the headstone, tracing the letters of her name with numb fingers. Margaret Ann Walker, beloved wife and teacher. Such simple words for such an extraordinary life. "I'm trying," he told the stone. "I'm trying to keep my promise. But I don't know how to do this without you. Everything feels wrong. The house is too quiet. Your roses are dead. I burned dinner 3 times this week because I forgot I was cooking. I know you'd laugh at that." He stayed until the cold became unbearable, then drove home through streets lit with holiday cheer that seemed to mock his sorrow. At home, he made a simple dinner and sat in front of the television, not really watching, just needing the noise. As midnight approached, he found himself in their bedroom, sitting on the floor in front of her closet. The scarves hung there like colorful ghosts. Charles touched each one, remembering. The red silk from San Francisco, they had eaten sourdough bread by the bay and watched sea lions lounging on the docks. The paisley print from their trip to Boston, Margaret had worn it to a fancy restaurant where they felt out of place and ended up giggling through the entire meal. The lavender wool from their last Christmas together, when she was still herself enough to enjoy the gift. On impulse, Charles began taking them down, one by one. He spread them across the bed, a kaleidoscope of memories. There must have been 200 scarves, each one a story, each one a piece of their life together. As he laid out the last one, a simple white cotton scarf she wore gardening, Charles made a decision. He would create something from these remnants. He didn't know what yet, a quilt, perhaps, or some kind of display. Something that would honor not just Margaret's memory but the ongoing ripples of her kindness. Maybe he could auction it for charity, raise money for school supplies or children in need. Margaret would like that, her scarves continuing to wrap others in warmth even after she was gone. The thought gave him the first spark of purpose he had felt since her death. It wasn't much, but it was something. A reason to get up tomorrow, a project that connected him to Margaret while also pushing him forward. He carefully folded each scarf, planning to research quilt makers or textile artists who might help him realize this vision. As the clock struck midnight, ushering in Christmas Day, Charles stood among the rainbow of scarves. Through the window, snow began to fall again, soft and silent. Somewhere in the distance, church bells rang. Charles touched the blue scarf, still in his jacket pocket where it had lived since the funeral. "Merry Christmas, sweetheart," he whispered to the empty room. Then, surprising himself, he smiled. It was a small smile, tinged with sadness, but genuine. Margaret had given him 40 years of Christmases. The least he could do was try to find gratitude for that gift, even through his grief. He would keep his promise. He would learn to live again, not moving on from Margaret but carrying her forward with him. Her love had transformed him once from a lonely mechanic into a husband worthy of her devotion. Perhaps it could transform him again, from a grieving widower into something else, someone who honored her memory by living fully, loving freely, and finding joy in unexpected places. It wouldn't be easy. The road ahead stretched long and uncertain. But, as Charles looked at the scarves spread across their bed, each one bright with possibility, he thought maybe, just maybe, he could do this. One day at a time, one memory at a time, one small act of living at a time. The snow continued to fall, blanketing the world in fresh white. Tomorrow, Charles decided, he would start tending the roses again, cutting back the dead growth to make room for spring's eventual return. Margaret's garden would bloom again, and, perhaps, in time, so would he.